Climate change, the worst story ever. It's ubiquitous, but very hard to pin down. It's being caused by everyone and everything. It's sort of everything and nothing. Elizabeth Colbert, environmental journalist and author of The Sixth Extinction. I'm Christine, and I'm trying to think of a better story to tell about climate change. I'm a Berlin-based digital communications professional, and I work for EIT Climate-KIC, Europe's leading climate change innovation initiative. I also casually study and forage things you can find in the forest, like plants, fungi, lichen, etc. This talk will explore current approaches to climate communications at a micro and macro level, from peer-to-peer interactions to global media, and how both can work together to create rooted and resilient networks of meaning, a sustained level of science-based awareness and engagement on climate change. First, I'll explain how to translate climate science to the public. Second, I'll describe how connecting with people as individuals to their identities, values, and worldviews can help them care more about climate change. Third, I'll identify narratives with a global appeal. Finally, I'll explore how you can combine multiple climate talking points to greater effect. What this work uncovers is that a deeper ideological shift is necessary to living sustainably and ensuring we do for generations to come. We all have to work together to write the story of how we get better. In this way, the story becomes a metaphorical forest made up of emerging, evolving, dying, repurposed, and ultimately connected and mutually reinforcing climate change narratives. The IPCC report says limiting global warming to 1.5 Celsius would require rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. The required speed, scale, and granularity of these changes can be intimidating. The good news is climate science has already revealed many helpful actions we can already take. Tree planting, keeping fossil fuels in the ground, and transitioning to renewables like solar and wind, as well as transforming how we grow our food and what we eat, for example, by increasing gardening and veganism in cities, and radically decreasing consumption are just some of the many ways we can lower greenhouse gas emissions and CO2, biodiversity loss, and climate change. So what's stopping us? When the IPCC report calls for changes in all aspects of society, this implies that successful climate change mitigation and adaptation require the involvement and support of all aspects of society. As we increasingly experience the felt effects of climate change, like hotter summers and milder winters, climate change is increasingly becoming a concern to the public, shaping voting patterns, consumer behaviors, careers, and more. But it wasn't always this way. Climate change is already hard to communicate because it's been relatively invisible to people. We also haven't been able to communicate climate science in a way that people understand and that motivates them to change. Despite waves of environmental movements, climate change remained a relatively economically, politically, and socially marginalized issue until quite recently, and didn't gather the diverse skill sets needed to secure sufficient political and public buy-in. For this reason, climate scientists nobly rose to the challenge of also communicating the science. However, communications is its own science, and to do this well also necessitates a lot of training, experience, domain knowledge, and specialization. And informing and motivating people to act on climate is difficult enough without well-funded disinformation campaigns and lobbying by the fossil fuel industry. Climate communications is therefore a relatively new career path, full of uncertainty and a need to experiment, feed on errors, learn quickly, and iterate on the work. The benefit of such a context is it hasn't inherited a legacy of dominant, dogmatic, in-principle assertions endemic to some other disciplines, which reveal problematic idealizations of our cognitive power. For now, it exists more in practice. Focusing on practice offers the chance to correctly position knowledge as cumulative and up for revision, an honest reckoning with human cognitive limitations and possibilities. First, there are a few guidelines for communicating climate science that have been found to work well. Communicate using plain language. Be concise and get to the point quickly. Repeat the same messages. Connect felt effects to climate science. Stay positive. Use trusted messengers. Communicate using memorable stories. Use visuals, humor, and other creative forms of engagement. And encourage dialogue. When scientists talk about climate models, people can get lost in the details. That's why it's advised to anchor communications in the core facts. You might say, global warming is an increase in the Earth's temperature, which changes climate patterns. Warming happens when heat-trapping gases are released into the atmosphere, for example, by burning fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas for energy. We're seeing the impacts now in more frequent and severe heat waves, wildfires, droughts, and floods. 25 years ago, Susan Joy Hazell was working with climate scientists on translating their findings to the general public when no one else was. Hazell says scientists use words the public uses, but to mean different things. For example, scientists often use the term positive feedback, which the public might associate to receiving positive feedback on a job well done. However, scientists use this to describe a vicious cycle in the climate system, whereby warming causes even more warming. Hazell has identified 150 words and expressions that create differences between the science and how it's perceived by the public. Climate communications research also finds that certain words and concepts have negative associations and can make people more resistant to proposed solutions, especially if they're associated with politics they don't agree with. Some examples are regulate, restrict, cut, control, and tax. What alternative words and concepts can we use then? Some climate communicators suggest using words like entrepreneurship, free market, and competition because they're well received by the public. But this example reveals the largest challenge climate communicators face today. How do we motivate people using words and concepts they connect with while also challenging the status quo? That is, the extractivism, competition, and consumerism driving climate change. How do we inspire new and necessary sustainable ways of being? If you pander to comfort zones, nothing changes. If you present something alienating, people dig their heels in and nothing changes. In this line of work, these missteps can literally feel like the end of the world, but they will and must happen. As I mentioned earlier, this discipline is new and there are no silver bullet communication strategies. There's only humility, learning by doing, near constant iteration, and humble successes, for now. But we're not totally in the dark. There's evidence supporting the idea that messages resonate more with people when they connect to them personally, to their identities, values, worldviews, etc. And among climate communicators, this approach is recognized as particularly effective. Interestingly, however, most of our engagement activities are still tailored towards the general public. The reason could be that approaching climate communications with this level of granularity and at scale is an intimidating task, but some organizations are trying it. Climate Outreach is one such organization. It specializes in how to engage hard-to-reach audiences, developing climate connection programs with communities such as youth, center-right, faith, and migrant groups. There are some general guidelines for connecting to individuals that have been found to work well. Understand what the audience knows and doesn't know. Identify their identity, values, worldviews, beliefs, attitudes, etc. Connect with what matters to them. Use a shared language. Use trusted messengers. Frame climate change as personally relevant and provide tangible examples. Help them realize what they can do and key actions they can take. Climate Outreach says there are different ways to understand your audience so you can tailor your messaging. For example, surveys, focus groups, and stakeholder engagement. Additionally, testing strategies, narratives, and communications materials with a sample of your target audience helps gauge reactions and avoid backlash. Climate Outreach's Global Narratives approach is the first initiative to develop communications methodology to build capacity in specific locations, to train local organizations in testing and developing effective climate change communications. The Global South has been particularly neglected in this regard, with most climate narratives appealing to the Global North and appearing in global media, as well as appealing to people who are already engaged on climate. Climate Outreach's Global Narratives Workshop leads participants through a series of questions. What do you care about? What do you dislike? What makes you proud of who you are? How do you feel about your country and your place in it? What changes have you noticed, and what concerns do you have for the future? What does it mean to you, and what do you think causes it? What are the impacts, and how can you and others cope? What do renewables mean to you, and can they replace fossil fuels? After these conversations, short prepared narratives are handed out to the participants along with red and green highlighters. One by one, the facilitator reads out the narrative to the group and asks them to read it to themselves and highlight any words or passages they feel strongly positive about in green and any they feel strongly negative about in red. Then the group discusses what they highlighted and why. Later, the marked narratives are analyzed alongside transcripts from the discussions in order to generate recommendations on what messaging to use and what to avoid. Finding that images of polar bears, melting ice caps, and smoking chimneys were relatively ineffective at connecting with people, Climate Outreach realized that developing a captivating, diverse, and people-focused visual language was necessary. They developed the Climate Visuals website to support journalists, researchers, campaigners, photographers, and filmmakers in telling powerful new visual stories with local flavor. Climate communications professionals can also be strategic about the groups they engage, considering potential impact. For example, with over 80% of the world's population identifying as belonging to a religion, and with houses of worship existing nearly everywhere, it would be wise to consider how climate justice could be relevant to these communities. The following is an example of how two different people, an atheist and a Christian, may be motivated towards the same climate action. A science-loving atheist may support protecting forests because forests remove CO2 from the air, while a devout Christian may care about protecting forests because of the belief that one must conserve God's creation. The vast majority of Europeans are very/extremely worried to somewhat worried about climate change. Yet people don't talk about climate change often or ever in their daily lives. In America, 60% of people say they rarely or never discuss it with their friends or family. We've seen using trusted messengers recommended a few times now. Arguably, the most powerful incarnation of this is peer-to-peer communication, talking to partners, friends, and family members about climate change. Climate Outreach's Talking Climate Handbook, supported by EIT Climate-KIC, was designed to help people have conversations about climate change in their daily lives. The Talking Climate Handbook suggests you use real talk in these conversations. Respect your conversational partner and find common ground. Enjoy the conversation. Ask questions. Listen and show you've heard. Tell your story. Action makes it easier, but doesn't fix it. Learn from the conversation. And keep going and keep connected. These may seem like obvious recommendations, but what they really are ways to ensure you maintain a good faith conversation. Once good faith is lost, a conversation on climate change may have the opposite of your intended effect, pushing your conversational partner further into skepticism or denial. Nothing that we do, no matter how brilliant, how technologically innovative, can reach the traction and impact that we need it to be, unless we begin to very rapidly scale up our insights and capacities for understanding the psychological dimension of climate change. Renee Lertzman, psychologist. EIT Climate-KIC offers a free online course engaging people on climate change. It was co-created with Dr. Renee Lertzman, who has focused on psychology and climate change for a few decades now. The course identifies ways people confront climate change information at a psychological level and how climate communicators might help them move past their defense mechanisms. People's powerful responses to climate change can interfere with their ability to take action. When presented with challenging information that clashes with their identity, who they are, and what they care about, people can have feelings like guilt, shame, and powerlessness. Such feelings can trigger internal conflict, like cognitive dissonance, and defense mechanisms, including denial, disavowal, and rationalizing. Traditional communications approaches like educating, cheerleading, enticing, nudging, fear, and the righting reflex, that is, the strong urge to tell people the solution to their problem because we feel we know it would work, can be counterproductive. They can trigger defense mechanisms. But by understanding the psychology of people's reactions to climate change, we can start to imagine ways to get through to them. Instead of pounding away with the same impersonal arguments, we need to start having conversations that take a human or society-centered approach. This could entail, for example, making a reflection or summary of what your conversational partner is saying, emphasizing whatever change talk you've heard, and asking for clarification, thereby avoiding the righting reflex. The goal is to have your conversational partner fit climate action into their life in a way that makes sense for them, not for you to do it for them. We've explored bottom-up, individualized climate communications and learned this requires quite a bit of resources like research, the construction of multiple narratives, and people on the ground willing to engage their peers. For this reason, possible top-down approaches with the potential of more for less become incredibly tantalizing. So are there any? As we gather more data on what connects to different identities, values, and worldviews, some common themes emerge. I call these narratives with mass resonance. They are intergenerational responsibility, public health, and prosperity. Climate change legal actions have been attempted since the 90s. These cases typically involve youth and children as they represent the class most affected by government action or inaction. However, such cases have generally been dismissed. In August 2018, at age 15, Greta Thunberg started spending her school days outside the Swedish parliament to call for stronger action on climate change by holding up a sign reading, "School Strike for Climate." By 2019, there were multiple coordinated city protests happening around the globe, each involving over 1 million people, mostly students. Her impact on the world stage has been described as the Greta effect. Greta's main talking point is that climate change will have a disproportionate effect on young people and that their futures are being stolen. This involves the concept of Earth overshoot. That is, adults are consuming so excessively they're using up the Earth's resources, like freshwater, forests, fish stocks, etc., beyond their ability to regenerate and provide for future generations. It's difficult to quantify the effectiveness of the Greta effect. Motivating millions upon millions of people to engage in political activism for the environment does spread awareness of climate science, generate a critical mass of public engagement for politicians to see, and has undeniably helped normalize climate change as a topic in the public discourse. In June 2019, a YouGov poll in Britain found that public concern about the environment had reached record levels in the UK since Thunberg and Extinction Rebellion had, quote, pierced the bubble of denial. In February 2019, Thunberg shared a stage with the then president of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, where he claimed, "In the next financial period, from 2021 to 27, every fourth euro spent within the EU budget will go towards action to mitigate climate change." Climate change also played a significant role in the European Parliament elections in May 2019, as Green parties recorded their best ever result, increasing MEP seat numbers from 52 to 72. Many of the gains came from the northern European countries where young people had taken to the streets during Fridays for Future. In July 2019, inspired by Thunberg, wealthy philanthropists and investors from the US donated about $600,000 to support Extinction Rebellion and school strike groups to establish the Climate Emergency Fund. Trevor Nielsen, one of the philanthropists, said 3 founders would be considering contacting friends from among the global mega rich to donate, quote, 100 times more in the weeks and months ahead. Recently, and perhaps relatedly, Jeff Bezos pledged to create a $10 billion Earth Fund. However, activists are justifiably skeptical about the mega-rich's commitment to effectively dismantling the high-carbon economic system they built their wealth upon. Thunberg can also be credited with accelerating the anti-flying movement by promoting train travel instead. The buzzword associated with this is flight shame. It's a phenomenon in which people feel social pressure not to fly because of associated emissions and climate change. For example, traveling from London to Amsterdam by train instead of plane cuts CO2 emissions by 83%. Sweden reported a 4% drop in domestic air travel for 2019 and an increase in rail. And the number of people flying between German cities fell 12% in November from a year earlier. Meanwhile, Deutsche Bahn has reported record passenger numbers. In September, Germany's parliament voted in a climate package, including a tax cut aimed at reducing train ticket prices by around 10%, while Deutsche Bahn is planning for all their intercity trains to run on renewables. And yet, we're beginning to see how these larger narratives are less resilient than peer-to-peer communications, and they are particularly vulnerable to being co-opted. Recently, a 19-year-old German vlogger dubbed the anti-Greta, Naomi Seibt, was promoted heavily by leading figures on the far right. Her mother, a lawyer, has represented politicians from the Alternative für Deutschland, AfD, party in court. Seibt's been quoted as saying, "Climate change alarmism at its very core is a despicably anti-human ideology." She's been paid by the Heartland Institute, a think tank closely allied with the White House, to make climate denial videos. One could argue that once a narrative, movement, etc. becomes large enough, it's vulnerable to being co-opted. The key is to ensure one is always generating and framing the discourse and is never in a reactive position. Instead, pushing into the ever new and exciting edge of the Overton window and drawing the public along. This is, of course, no easy task. Economic, political, and social realities help determine which of these influencers, or child gods, will be favored. People who are insecure, lacking access to education and Medicare, for example, and who live in societies with greater wealth disparity, for example in the US, are more likely to support strongman figures playing to their defense mechanisms, whereas those who are secure are inclined to support figures advocating for courage, collectivism, and action. Climate change is a public health crisis. The frequency, intensity, and duration of heat waves, droughts, wildfires, floods, and storms are increasing. As average temperatures rise, so will heat-related disorders. Air pollution and relatedly respiratory illness can worsen. High CO2 concentrations are associated with decreased mental performance. Climate change increases the transmission of certain diseases, creates food insecurity, causes mass migration and most likely increased violence, and threatens our mental health and well-being, eco-anxiety. As we explored earlier, fear narratives, like focusing only on climate change's many adverse health effects, can trigger defense mechanisms. This is why the topic of public health must be handled carefully and even cleverly. We may look to a few historical examples of moments when a public health crisis fueled by environmental abuse mobilized political action. In 1952, a thick layer of smog settled over London, England. The severe air pollution event was caused by the city's excessive use of coal and lasted 5 days. It's estimated up to 12,000 people died and 100,000 more were made ill. Environmental legislation since the Great Smog of London, such as the City London Act in 1954 and the Clean Air Acts of 1956 and 68, introduced measures to address air pollution, like the mandated movement towards smokeless fuels. Financial incentives were offered to households to replace open coal fires with alternatives such as gas fires. Some talking points used to gather support for such measures were the social and economic costs of air pollution, and that clean air was as important as clean water. This is clever messaging because it normalizes clean air by comparing it to clean water, which was already viewed favorably and had been successfully fought for in the previous century. Why had it been fought for? Well, before the Great Smog of 1952, there was the Great Stink of 1858. The Great Stink happened when hot weather brought out the smell of human and industrial waste present on the banks of the River Thames. This waste was also linked to the transmission of cholera. It's here we see a great example of environmental action through satire, with many cartoons of the day highlighting the unacceptable state of things and mocking government in action. Death rose on the Thames, claiming the lives of victims who have not paid to have the river cleaned up. The monster soup commonly called Thames water. A drop of Thames water. The figure of Dirty Father Thames featured prominently in these political illustrations. Filthy river, foul from London to the Nore, what art thou but one vast gutter, one tremendous common shore? London's first major cholera epidemic struck in 1831 and claimed 6,556 victims. In 1848 to 49, there was a second outbreak and 14,137 Londoners died. This was followed by a third one in 1853 to 54, in which 10,738 people died. Following the Great Stink of London, government authorities accepted a proposal for an integrated and fully functioning sewer system from the civil engineer Joseph Bazalgette. This marked the beginning of London's sewage reform. During the 1970s and 80s, the ozone hole was identified by scientists, which was linked to an increase in skin cancer. The hole was caused by the use of manufactured chemicals. An international treaty to phase out a number of these chemicals, the Montreal Protocol on Substances that Deplete the Ozone Layer, was agreed to on the 26th of August, 1987, and entered into force exactly 2 years later. With the parties to the protocol having phased out 98% of their ozone-depleting substances, they saved an estimated 2 million people from skin cancer every year. Why was the protocol so successful? It's speculated it's because much of the negotiation was held in small informal groups. This enabled a genuine exchange of views and created trust, and the people negotiating the treaty also included scientists, which lent credibility. We must also note that the ozone-damaging chemical industry didn't have the lobbying power fossil fuel companies have today. While governments declared climate emergencies and merely philosophized about what an actual emergency response to climate change could look like, the coronavirus pandemic propelled countries globally into economic, political, and social measures, including shutting down the economy, that is, closing shops, cafes, restaurants, etc., as well as borders. These measures could certainly be described as anything but business as usual, and as reflecting an emergency taken seriously. While these responses have been imperfect, and there is much to criticize, it's worth wondering why this pandemic has mobilized action in a way climate change hasn't. As we explored earlier, some reasons are that climate change is relatively slower to show its impacts, and it's larger in scope and therefore requires a multi-solutions approach representing a heavier cognitive load, i.e., it's not solved by a silver bullet technology like a vaccine. Plus, years of corporate lobbying has spread disinformation and slowed action. Moreover, coronavirus feels personal. That's because it's spread person to person and invades the body. Could a greater narrative emphasis on the body, such as the presence of microplastics in our digestive tracts or pollution in our lungs, spur more climate action? Images of nurses with mask-creased faces, red and bleeding skin have invaded our social networks, accompanied by the hashtag #StayHome. This invokes wartime propaganda, asking for people to do their part and glorifying sacrifice. We will see the same messaging if the climate crisis worsens. It's essential we counter these messages that distract from government accountability and position avoidable suffering as acceptable. Key to this is creating alliances between essential workers, medical professionals, educators, grocery store clerks, etc., and activists. Both COVID-19 and climate change feature famous exponential growth charts. Yet we know this cannot be. As was the case with the Spanish flu, flu curves are necessarily flattened if the virus spreads through the population, infecting and killing people until herd immunity is eventually reached. Climate change and its knock-on effects also have the potential to kill off populations to such an extent that exceeding planetary boundaries through consumption habits no longer occurs. Over the decades, the eco-fascist idea that civilization is fundamentally in conflict with the environment, and Malthusianism, which advocates for population control as a means to avert resource insecurity, have seeped into the public imagination. In addition to this, despair, resignation, and fatalism stemming from eco-anxiety have made climate collapse accepted as possible, if not probable. The coronavirus, on the other hand, carries no such baggage. However, we again see how these large narratives of courage, collectivism, and action can be countered with defense mechanisms, individualism, and inaction. Anti-vaxxer conspiracy theorists are coming out hard against the development of a coronavirus vaccine, linking it to, of all things, 5G communications networks. In the US, the epicenter of the anti-vaccination movement is the Children's Health Defense. CHD has spread the rumor that COVID-19 lockdown is being used opportunistically for the installation of 5G masks. It also ran a piece suggesting that the pandemic provides cover for a sinister, quote, global agenda trying to make us all, quote, subjects of a techno-communist global government, a stance redolent of the major eco-fascist figure Ted Kaczynski, also known as the Unabomber. As leading health experts have affirmed, the climate crisis is a threat multiplier, particularly for communities suffering from environmental injustice. And climate change isn't a future risk. The impacts are occurring now. With a growing aging population and no climate action, these impacts will get considerably worse. For example, heat-related deaths in the UK are projected to increase by about 2.5 times to over 7,000 by the 2050s. The barriers to addressing the public health crisis that is climate change are primarily sociopolitical, rather than technical or economic. Crucially, the sooner mitigative strategies are implemented, the sooner nations could avoid massive costs in healthcare and emergency relief. Some prosperity narratives focus on how climate action can raise resource efficiency and stimulate innovation and new investment in infrastructure to improve the economy. However, as we've explored, our current economic system, which aims for infinite growth, is a major driver of climate change. It's therefore necessary we reconceptualize prosperity not as an ever-increasing GDP, as financial stability and meeting, not exceeding, one's needs. Importantly, this will involve narratives that challenge consumerism and the myth of green growth, and relatedly, the concept of decoupling. Relative decoupling refers to a decline in the ecological intensity per unit of economic output. In this situation, resource impacts decline relative to the GDP, which could itself still be rising. In other words, total material throughput and emissions can continue to rise. Absolute decoupling refers to a situation in which resource impacts decline in absolute terms. Sufficient absolute decoupling remains unproven, and when we're running out of time, we can't afford to make decisions based on wishful thinking when we know what works now. Prosperity doesn't only have material associations. It can also refer to experiences that help us thrive physically, intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually. Walking through a forest, access to a community of people we care about, exercise, and growing a garden are all experiences with low planetary impact. We can even co-opt economic language for our purposes. For example, quote, leading an enriched life to refer to a sustainable lifestyle. Growthism is anti-intellectual in the sense that it prevents us from thinking about what we actually want the economy and our society to achieve. GDP comes to stand in for thought itself. Jason Hickel, economic anthropologist. One environmental movement that focuses on reimagining prosperity is degrowth. Degrowth emphasizes the need to reduce production and consumption in the global north and advocates for a socially just and sustainable society with well-being as an indicator for prosperity instead of GDP. Well-being can include, for example, life expectancy and self-reported life satisfaction and happiness. The movement relies heavily on economic data to support its claims. For example, indicators of well-being are higher the more equitable a society is. In other words, people are happier in societies when wealth disparity is small. What we find as well-being isn't exclusively coupled with GDP growth. Not to mention, climate change, as it's linked to GDP growth, would certainly negatively impact people's well-being. The real power of GDP growth as a metric and narrative is that it's just enough to convince people that the system is working who would otherwise be quite aware that it's not. 28% of all new income from global GDP growth over the last 40 years has gone to the richest 1%, all millionaires. In other words, nearly 1/3 of our labor, resource extraction, and CO2 emissions have been done to make rich people richer. Hickel also makes the point that, in psychology, the capacity for self-restraint in the face of excess is considered to be a mark of maturity, empathy, and wisdom. And yet, applying this principle to consumption is considered unthinkable. These degrowth narratives both challenge the economic growth paradigm and offer a new vision of prosperity that centers humans and the environment. Intergenerational responsibility, public health, and prosperity narratives can be combined to create a holistic approach to climate storytelling. Since each of these topics benefit from climate change mitigation and adaptation, communications professionals can lead with climate or lead with a co-benefit. Here are some examples. We have a responsibility to solve climate change to make sure everyone, especially our children, can lead healthy and prosperous lives. We can reduce death, illness, and financial costs from climate change if we prioritize our children, public health, and prosperity. Ideally, over time, climate action and its co-benefits merge so thoroughly that they become one and the same. Narrative Economics is the book by Robert Shiller that references many historical moments of crisis and related transformative narratives which either contributed to or helped mitigate those crises. Might some of these kinds of narratives be applied to climate change? For example, the price increase of commodities between the end of World War I and 1920 was widely blamed on business people who were labeled with the word profiteer. Could the narrative figure of the profiteer be applied to big corporates and governments who benefit off the backs of the environment, public health, and our children's futures? We have seen a taste of this with the popular 100 companies are responsible for 71% of emissions talking point. However, this failed to mobilize adequate action. The reason, perhaps, is these companies largely provide energy to consumers, keeping their homes warm and their car tanks full. So people couldn't wholly distance themselves from culpability and assume a moral high ground. Again, we encountered the power of trusted messengers, with Schiller advocating for politicians and policymakers to take a more active role in narrative engineering, such as dispelling misinformation and fostering desired economic behavior. Of course, this would only be relevant to governments that support climate action. Christopher Booker argues there are only a few basic plot lines: overcoming the monster, rags to riches, the quest, voyage, and return, and comedy, tragedy, and rebirth. At the core of these examples are stories of various kinds of transformation through confrontation: social, economic, spatial, and personal. Could fitting the climate issue into these familiar plots help connect it to people? Could the monster we need to overcome be climate change? Or perhaps corrupt elites like fossil fuel CEOs and colluding governments who have profited at the planet's expense, at our expense? How might we tell a rags to riches story that rejects our current conception of prosperity, one in which we become truly prosperous as healthy individuals living in accordance with the environment and satisfied with our needs simply being met? How about a homecoming story? We build a closer relationship to the environment, in this way, returning to ourselves as part of it. There are a few aesthetic and literary movements associated with positive climate action, like Afrofuturism. Another that's gaining popularity is solar punk. Solar punk creators imagine what a sustainable world could look like and how we can get there. Solar punk typically features Art Nouveau motifs, heavily green cityscapes, diversity and community, and of course, solar and wind power. But solar punk is still quite niche. There's much work that needs to be done here. We've just thoroughly explored climate change communications, its history, the status quo, and potential experiments in storytelling. We've learned that our ever-evolving understanding of climate science should be at the core of all our communications, and that a good faith, one-on-one conversation is the most resilient but small-scale form of engagement on climate change. And narratives relating to intergenerational responsibility, public health, and prosperity are particularly effective at inspiring large audiences towards action, yet are less resilient and especially vulnerable to being co-opted. These micro and macro climate communications work together, offering an entry point to lasting change. A deeper confrontation with and transformation of our relationship to the environment, each other, and ourselves. Informed by climate science and ecology, what's common to all these narratives is a different way of being in the world. A rejection of the dominant Hobbesian idea that humankind is fundamentally insecure and adversarial. The truth is, we have the capacity for both selfishness and generosity, and we can make choices about how to be and what will enable us to collectively survive. Indeed, climate change may be the worst story ever, but it's not a terribly new one. The first human adaptation known to us is foraging. As tribes realized the importance of food security and strengthened numbers for their survival, they developed stories to reinforce these supporting behaviors. These stories warn of antisocial behaviors like deception, stinginess, and theft, which could put groups at risk of food stress. This is famously embodied in the mythological trickster figure. Sound familiar? As we take a closer look at the environment, its interdependencies, tensions, temporalities, processes, etc., may become more familiar to us. But nature isn't a self-regulating system, and there's much we cannot perceive or measure. Once we let go of the idea the environment is totally balanced, calculable, and controllable, and that humans must infinitely dominate whatever's around them, we can begin to understand nature as a humble approximation. We can slow down and think beyond ourselves. Only then can we truly integrate sustainable behaviors into our lives, becoming better stewards, collaborators, and observers of the many people and organisms we encounter. We will have written a story worth living for.
I sent you questions over Twitter.
Cool, let's see.
Also, if you want to put on a slide that's maybe an image or something like that you want to stay on for the answer.
Sure. Maybe that one?
Yeah, that's nice. I sent them to you over Twitter.
I see them. Yeah.
Okay, good.
So shall I begin?
Yeah.
Oh, cool. Okay. So the first question is, some environmentalists orgs / movements often have messages along the lines of listen to the scientists, believe science, etc. Do you think there are any risks / limitations to using this kind of message? Yeah, I think this message is largely good, but it doesn't really link to any sort of like specifics surfaced by climate science. So I think that could be the limitation. Like ultimately, you want to have a really clear idea of what people can do now to help support the climate movement. So I think having some very simple, talking points related to that could be really useful. But I think the line of believe scientists actually can be somewhat effective just in terms of like if someone's saying that is a trusted messenger, that kind of creates like a social proof around believing scientists. So it's effective in that way. Okay, the next question is, interested in what you think about Latour's idea to call our matters of concern over matters of fact when arguing for climate change mitigation. He calls for matters of fact partial and polemical renderings of matters of concern. Matters of concern he calls gatherings of ideas, forces, and players in which things and issues, not facts, come to be because they are supported, cared for, worried over. Yeah, so
I can try to clarify.
yeah.
Wait, I'll see what he wrote more. Ask him to clarify it, and then you can write again.
Yeah, maybe just what the specific. I guess I can kind of riff on it. I just think I don't know if I would necessarily like. I would say probably like do both, just like off the cuff would be my intuition. Yeah, I mean, I'm inclined to agree with Latour there, but I also think I think there's like weight to fact as it like relates to the science, like science that we know to be true. And like I showed earlier, like in these slides, like there's just some core scientific facts you can really anchor all your climate action and all your climate talking points in. So yeah, I think like the facts as they might refer to like specific climate models, which of course are nonlinear and can change over time. I would agree that that can be a bit problematic, but I think, I think the general, you know, moving in the same direction together is really important. Okay, so then the third question is, what do you think of the term degrowth from a climate communication perspective? Yeah, this one is, I think it's one that's been addressed in many areas. Like, I think it's definitely one of the core criticisms of degrowth. What people say is that degrowth, I mean, in studies, does have negative associations, and people react to it negatively, unfortunately, because I think growth can be associated with, for example, personal growth. So just the term itself can be problematic in that regard. And then I think also as degrowth, it's like a reaction to growth and not its own thing. So I know that's another criticism of it. On the other hand, though, like I think it's possible that if this term starts being used like just more generally, like I think the movement is still somewhat niche, but when you know if you start seeing like for example the IPCC report using this term, which I think they will soon, and then more like politicians and economists, like if it becomes more mainstream, then it can probably just become more acceptable in that way. So it's all to say like that might change, and I think at the same time too, you don't always have to use degrowth. You can talk about like a growth or being like growth agnostic, because ultimately too, I think what is needed now is degrowth. But if we were to reach, for example, like steady state economics, if we successfully implement degrowth, then that economic structure would fluctuate between growth and degrowth. So it wouldn't be like just unequivocally degrowth, right? Degrowth forever. That's not the point. Yeah. All right, so what common obstacles do you think degrowth has to deal with? Yeah, I think I probably just covered that a little bit. Um, are there, so clarification, are there any alternatives to relying on science's truth claims? R.E. Latour. Yeah, I think definitely. Like, I think this sort of what I was discussing around, like, presenting, um, like, constructing a totally different world that's based on a kind of pragmatism and different way of being in the world might be a way to sidestep getting like really anchored in the facts in that way. And I think yeah, presenting things like lifestyles, like alternative lifestyles and communities could also help rally support from a more like, I guess, like ideological standpoint. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but I hopefully. Um, how do we keep regulatory top-down conversations small in a time of social media and expected transparency from broad publics? Small. Uh, I'm not sure what is meant by that. Maybe clarify on that one a little more. Yeah. Um, okay. As much as it is a crisis, in my conversations, I often find using the term crisis drives panic and helplessness. I almost feel I need to downscale climate change mechanisms to make them feel actionable by challenging their beliefs, lifestyles, talking, joining communities, promoting value systems. What do you think about the value or dangers in this downplaying? Do you think it is useful or perpetuates misunderstanding? Yeah, this is a really great question. I think like my point about these like missteps, basically like challenging the status quo versus like pandering to people's comfort zones. Like this is really challenging, and like striking that balance well is going to really depend on the person you're talking to. So it is kind of like conversationally feeling out that person. So I think what you did is correct. Like if they seem to really object to the term crisis, yeah, for you to make it more approachable, I think is good actually. And you know, we find that we find a lot of evidence of learned helplessness in psychology. So once someone really feels overwhelmed and fear or despair, they can right away just move to like doomerism. We've seen this is quite common. So yeah, I think it's really contextual. Um, do you have any tips to protect practitioners feeling disillusioned and losing positivity? Oh yeah, that's a really good question too. I mean, I struggle with this myself. So yeah, basically, um, it's this quote that I like, which is pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. This is something I kind of anchor myself in a little bit. Is just sort of like really the importance of doing everything you can and having this pragmatic approach, but also taking your mental health into consideration. To kind of distance myself a bit from thinking about climate change all the time. I go into nature, I forage, and so I do these things that sort of like reconnect me with, yeah, with sort of like what I'm fighting for. I find this really helpful. Um, yeah, losing positivity. It's a challenge, but I think this is also pretty subjective. Like you need to do the things that feel good for you and help you kind of like reset and regain your energy to deal with the topic. Do you have direct examples of localized narratives, maybe from Berlin or somewhere else? Huh, yeah. Hmm, that's a good question. Yeah, it really depends. So, hmm, like there have been really interesting like in coal heavy regions, there have been really some really interesting projects on look that looks at old fossil fuel infrastructure and how to change it and actually like how to transform these high carbon spaces into like something really beautiful and community oriented. So yeah, there's definitely like narratives that are localized can relate to, for example, like local, like what would it be called? I'm drawing a blank. Like big local structures or like aspects of um, local flora and fauna that might have like a bit of a like cultural relevance. So yeah, like for example, in Scotland, there's like the Clyde River, and so Scotland was seen as like creating a lot of its sort of like history is like focused around this river. So if you anchor climate action like in a specific site, let's say, it can be really relevant to the people. But I think this also relates a bit to the climate outreaches work, actually, which I invite everyone to check. This is really one of the organizations I admire the most. They have a lot about how to like localize language and climate action, and they had like really great case studies around that. So yeah, I think they can probably do a better job of than I can of like speaking to those specific examples. But another thing, like I actually have a friend who did a really interesting project in Australia where it was like an art intervention project where there is this really dirty river, and it kind of had that like broken windows effect where it was already polluted, so people just like continued polluting it. And for his yeah, his art initiative actually like sectioned off a part of this river and cleaned the water, and then like invited like families, like children to come bathe and like people to basically like spend time near this like beautiful segment of the river to show what was possible. So really had like flipped the perception of this river, and yeah, so in like a highly localized context. So maybe those are a few good examples. Um, how can we help people feel a sense of significance in their individual actions, not only in changing their daily habits, but in how they choose to participate in the global economy when the scale of climate change is so massive and intimidating? Yeah, that is really tough. I think I would say like the number one like the most effective thing we can do is political activism, and is showing up and voting for political parties that you think best represent your values, and even better, like you yourself getting involved in politics if you can. Like obviously, people have different. There's different like privilege involved here, and different levels of commitment and ability to commit, but I've found that the like volunteering for different climate organizations, for example, and also anchoring work I do in the local community and seeing like immediate effects can be really helpful, and definitely keep me positive and feeling as though I have agency in the situation. So, um, for example, one thing I'm really interested in is food sovereignty, and I forage, and there's this whole history of fascist governments, for example, like disallowing foraging as a means to control food. And so actually like food systems are like highly political. So here in Berlin, when social distancing wasn't implemented, I was volunteering with the homeless, and I was foraging like a lot of food for them, so a lot of greens, and as well as we took donations. So this was like a small way I could see like immediate effect of the work I do and tie it into yeah, the larger like social justice context of climate change and ecology. Yeah, so I really understand this point, though. I mean, I myself feel like I'm never doing enough and feel frustrated about how slow things seem to be moving. But at the same time, I do see some positive signals for change. Um,
That's it.
okay, I think that's it. Yeah. Well, thank you, everyone.